Okay, Bismillah. So, the first thing we need to understand when we're dealing with atheism, in actual fact, when we're dealing with anything concerning Islam, when we want to articulate Islam to other people, or we want to defend Islam, or we want to give da'wah, we want to do outreach and reconnect human hearts to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if we want to do this, we have to understand Fitrah and first principles. It is paramount. Because when you're talking to another human being, you have to know what is the human being in order to engage with the human being. Not only this, when you understand Fitrah and first principles, you will know the role of rational arguments and their limits, right? And it would help you with Islamic epistemology, meaning how we get to know the truth and what is truth and how do you find truth from an Islamic perspective. So this is very important. If you understand Fitrah and first principles, it's going to help you understand the role of rational arguments when you're talking about Islam, and it would give you a sense of intellectual and emotional and spiritual maturity when you're dealing with other people. That you won't always debate everything. You won't always try to answer every single question. Rather, you'll be able to understand the human being as the human being is, so you could help create some awakenings within them. So, what are first principles? A first principle is a basic assumption that cannot be reduced any further. It's a very basic and necessary idea. It is something that is required in order to have knowledge in a particular sphere. For example, in science, in order to have scientific knowledge, you need some first principles or assumptions in place. A first principle or assumption of science is that causes have effects, and effects have causes. There is cause and effect. Also, a first principle of science is that nature is uniform. For example, if a scientist comes to Windsor and the scientist observes 1,000 white sheep, then they're going to conclude the next sheep is likely to be white, because they believe nature is uniform, so their observations to a certain degree will let them know about the rest of the universe. Now that may change with further observation, but when they have further observation, they still assume that nature is uniform and that pattern can continue. So it's important to understand that all spheres of knowledge have some first principles, have some assumptions in order for that sphere of knowledge to grow. Otherwise you'd have no knowledge at all. So just to repeat this idea, all spheres of knowledge have assumptions. All spheres of knowledge have first principles. And these things are ideas that cannot be reduced any further. They are necessary in order for that sphere of knowledge to grow. For example, another example. In mathematics, if you do something concerning set theory, say you're working out something, one of the assumptions in set theory in the philosophy of mathematics is that infinities exist. They can't prove it, they just have to assume it. They use it as an assumption, they adopt it as an assumption, or a first principle if you like, and it allows that sphere of knowledge to grow, or for you to actually continue in that sphere of knowledge, for it to make sense, for it to be coherent. Even in different spheres of knowledge, even in politics, you have first principles, right? You have first principles about, the nature of the human being, for example. In liberalism, take liberalism, classical liberalism. There's many different forms of liberalism. It's a disputatious doctrine, but forget that. The point is, basic classical liberalism has an assumption. The assumption is how they view the human being. They believe the human being is an abstract entity devoid of social attachments, right? That's how we see the human being. This is how we're going to start. the human being is rational and is an individual, right? And he is an entity that doesn't have any social obligations or attachments per se. That's an old kind of classical liberal understanding. The feminist philosopher Marilyn Friedman, that's what she says. She says individualism, which is the basis of liberalism, is the view that the human being is an abstract entity devoid of any social attachments. Point here is everything has first principles, all right? Let's go back to another first principle in science. Like, science also requires that you have external causal connections in the world. Science works only if the world is real, right? But you can't really prove the world is real, even if you touch it and feel it. You know, it could be that my brain is in Mars, and there's an alien with metal probes in my brain, and my brain is just in a vat, yeah? And it's making me think and feel what I'm thinking and feeling right now. I'm not saying that's the case, but I'm saying you have to start somewhere. You have to have first principles. And this is in every sphere of knowledge. And the idea of first principles is something that is discussed within metaphysics, okay? Metaphysics is a very interesting branch of philosophy. And this is a really, really good definition of metaphysics that includes first principles. This was taken from the essay, Is the Matter of Metaphysics Immaterial? So the author says, ultimately then, metaphysics reveals a method of analysis to understand problems from first principles, and then allows the challenges that those problems present to be addressed at the causative levels, at the hidden roots, not just the visible branches. In this way, metaphysics precedes method. So as I said, you don't have to understand that quote, by the way, so don't worry, okay? The point is, understand the concept. Every sphere of knowledge has assumptions. Every sphere of knowledge has first principles. That's it. So everything I've said in the past 10 minutes can be summarized in that sentence, okay? Every sphere of knowledge has assumptions. Every sphere of knowledge has first principles that are necessary to adopt, even though you can't prove, in order for you to grow in that sphere of knowledge, in order for that sphere of knowledge to progress and grow. Does this point make sense so far? Who's got difficulty with this point? Now this point is going to be a key that's going to unlock so many different things for you, right? Because when you receive questions from people now, you won't always address their questions because you know that their question also has an assumption. Their question also has an assumption. So this idea of assumptions and first principles, when you exercise it properly, will basically give you the tools to address people in a very profound way. For example, one question that you can get, and if you use first principles it could really help you, is that, you know, I know human beings are here to be tested, but I wasn't given consent to be tested. So it's unfair. Some people try and answer the question with philosophical, theological gymnastics, right? But you can't answer the question. Because if you start to answer it, you've assumed or they've assumed. So what's the assumption of the question? Let's see if you could exercise your minds here. So someone says, hey, God is unfair. Fine, I'm here to be tested, but I wasn't given consent to be tested. Yes, sir?
Yeah, someone is worthy of consent.
Good. So you're getting there. So you're saying the assumption is that I should be given consent. Okay. So you're saying we don't need consent, or Allah is under no moral obligation to give you consent. Correct. But why? What's our metaphysic? What's our first principle? Yes?
Because Allah is the creator and we are the creation.
Absolutely. Allah is the creator, we're the creations. Allah owns us. He's under no moral obligation to give you consent because He owns you. The question assumes that you have self-ownership, right? But you don't. Allah owns you, right? So the question doesn't even apply. Consent for what? If I'm playing with my Lego toys and I'm building a castle, or say I build a robot, do I now have to say to the robot, hey robot, can I ask you permission to give you another leg, right? No, it's my robot. I put it together, I could dismantle it, I could do what I want, right? So from this point of view, Allah is under no moral obligation to give us consent to send us on earth in order for us to be tested, right? And also, we don't own ourselves. That's our metaphysics, that's our first principle. Now some people would have just answered the question by adopting their assumption, and we do that sometimes. Yeah, of course, I'm an individual, I have self-ownership, I am free, right? And you have this kind of different understanding, an understanding that's not in line with the Islamic tradition. So yeah, so you see how you exercise these ideas by going straight to the assumption. Good. So let's just exercise again this idea of first principles. So science has first principles. One of them is there are external causal connections that effects have causes. Okay? So if you didn't have this assumption, then science wouldn't really make any sense. Because when you observe things happening, you couldn't rationalize. When you observe things happening, you couldn't make connections between those two things. You'd be like, well, science wouldn't make any sense to you because you couldn't make connections between things. As I said, another assumption of science is the uniformity of nature, right? If we've observed gravity in the solar system, for example, we make an assumption that nature is uniform and we say gravity exists throughout the whole universe. But we haven't observed the whole universe, right? Because we have an assumption which is nature is uniform. As Professor Nicholas Maxwell, he says, modern science presupposes, which means has an assumption, that there exists some kind of unified pattern running through all natural phenomena. It being a basic aim of physics to articulate this pattern as a testable, comprehensive, unified theory. Even a specific field of knowledge within science, neuroscience, also has assumptions. One of the assumptions of neuroscience is that the brain can be reduced to physical processes. That's an assumption. Sorry, consciousness can be reduced to physical processes. That what happens in the brain is identical to consciousness, and specifically in a subjective conscious state. That's an assumption. That can't be proven because science, because neuroscience is a science of correlations. They see some patterns in the brain and they correlate it to conscious activity. It's just a correlation. You can't prove it's identical just by looking at correlations. But they have this as an assumption, okay? And that assumption is a philosophical one that needs philosophy. It doesn't need more science, because your science is actually assuming that thing that you think the thing that requires discussion, right? So take, for example, inner subjective conscious states. When I'm drinking some water, I have an inner subjective conscious experience, okay? Now that inner subjective conscious experience correlates with something happening in my brain. But is my inner subjective conscious experience identical to what's happening in my brain? No. To claim such a thing, you need to have an assumption in philosophy. Maybe you are a physicalist. You believe that consciousness can be reduced to or is identical to happenings in the brain. But that can't be proven. All you can prove is, when I have a conscious experience, this happens in my brain. It doesn't prove that they're the same. Or it doesn't prove that it can only be reduced to physical processes. So neuroscience has a hell of a lot of assumptions. Well, has assumptions. And even neuroscientists themselves and philosophers, they say that neuroscience has assumptions. And you can read these quotes for yourself. For example, Manzotti and Moderato, they say that neurosciences are not metaphysically innocent. They say that empirical data needs to be interpreted from the perspective of some premise. Rex Wilson, he also says that an assumption of neuroscience, that inner subjective conscious experience, can be reduced to neurobiology. That's an assumption. And then they use it, they adopt that assumption in order for them to continue and grow in that sphere of knowledge. Take even logic, logical reasoning. Logical reasoning has first principles and assumptions as well. Take this argument here, this deductive argument, okay? Number one, all bachelors are unmarried men. Number two, John is a bachelor. Number three, therefore John is an unmarried man. Now the conclusion, number three, is what you call something that necessarily follows. You cannot have another conclusion here. This conclusion necessarily follows, okay? And one of the reasons it necessarily follows is because there are logical connections between the premises, the first two statements, and the conclusion. There is a logical connection that makes our mind conclude. We have a rational insight based upon the two premises, 1 and 2, statements 1 and 2, and we somehow connect them logically to conclude something that necessarily follows. Now, what is the first principle here? Who knows what the first principle here is? Not of that particular argument, but of logical reasoning. So we're saying that the conclusion necessarily logically follows. What's the first principle? What's the assumption here? Yes?
Bachelors are not married.
No. Say we've just accepted that. But you're right, we've assumed that but it's not really an assumption because by definition, bachelors, that's how we define it, are unmarried men, right? So just forget the specifics of the statements. What I'm saying is, what is the first principle of the logical reasoning here? Yes? No, let's assume the premises are correct. Yes, you're right. That's one. That's not what I intended here, but that's true. So the brother is saying one first principle is that actually we can use our minds to come to logical conclusions, right? We have to assume that in some way. After all, we could have minds that cannot acquire truth. Maybe we've evolved just to do mistakes and to have an illusion of, being able to do logic. Maybe this is not logical at all in the sense that it's a representation of some kind of truth. But I'm looking for something different here. Yes? No. Forget the content of the premises. Think about the logical connections here. Yes? Yeah, absolutely. So the conclusion necessarily follows in a deductive argument. Why does it necessarily follow? Who can answer that question? We've assumed that's what deductive arguments do, right? Conclusions necessarily follow, right? But why should it necessarily follow? Yes? No, nothing to do with observation. You could change the statements there and put things that you've never observed. You could say, all x's are y's, right? A is an x, therefore A is a y. You don't know what A and X and Y is. These are unknowns. You could change it around where it doesn't require you to observe anything. Yes?
Bachelors exist?
No? We've already...
We assume that bachelors exist.
Yeah, but forget the statements, yeah? Because we could think about the conclusion, the logical connection at the end. We have to assume that there are things, that there are conclusions that necessarily follow in this way. So if I ask you the question, why does it necessarily follow? How are you going to answer? Yes?
You can't accept contradictions.
Oh, well, that wouldn't necessarily be a contradiction, but that's my next slide. Let's make it more easier. Why can't I be a bachelor and a married man at the same time? Because it's a contradiction. Why are contradictions false?
Because that's the first principle.
Exactly, that's the first principle. All contradictions are false. You just have to assume it. You can't prove contradictions are false, can you? It's the rules of the game. That you make up the rules of the game, and then you play the game. The game is not the rules, and the rules are not the game, but you need the rules for the game. But we made the rules up in order to play the game. What if I were to say to you, contradictions can exist? Then the law of contradiction won't apply to me. I've created a different first principle now. So even in logical reasoning, you have first principles. Because sometimes when we study at university and we do a very undergraduate level, or we read books from like popular, people, we get so excited because we have a certain level of knowledge and we think this knowledge is pure, right? Every sphere of knowledge has first principles and assumptions. Throw any at me. Let's do this game. Let's play this game. From psychology, especially psychology, right? What philosophical school are you adopting in order for your psychology to make sense? Are you behaviorist, right? If you have a behaviorist philosophical disposition, your psychology is going to be very different, right? Everything has first principles. Everything has assumptions. There is no such thing as a watertight, absolutely 100% pure knowledge or argument. Everything has first principles and assumptions.
So what is the again? Contradictions are...
No, in logical reasoning, the first principles are that we've made the rules up. That's the first principle. In a deductive argument, a conclusion necessarily follows, because we say in a deductive argument, a conclusion necessarily follows. And that's why there are differences of opinion in not only in Islamic schools of creed, but in Western philosophy on even how they see logic and how they understand. This is called the philosophy of logic. Yes, brother? Yeah, brilliant. You just jumped ahead of me, yeah? So, the brother said, well, how do you choose which first principles are best? Well, you choose first principles based on their coherence. How they help you to understand reality and yourself, which we're going to discuss later. Yes? No, I can't explain why. Well, you could explain why from a logical point of view, that the conclusion is logically connected to the previous statements in a way that is the only conclusion. But to say, well, why is that the case? Well, we don't know. We just made it. It's a rule that we made up. Yeah? No. So when you say, why does it necessarily follow? What I would say is the first principle here is, well, it necessarily follows because we've made the rule up, and the rule is our first principle in this case. You need to speak louder, I can't hear you.
Okay, so my question is, you mentioned points 1 and 2, and then you said is a conclusion that necessarily follows.
Yes.
And then you asked, why does it necessarily follow?
Yeah. Because that question will help you understand where the first principle is.
So what is the first principle?
The first principle is it necessarily follows because we've made a rule up. The logical rule is the first principle. Remember, something cannot be reduced any further. An assumption that you require in order for you to have a sphere of knowledge. If we didn't have the assumption that this is how deductive arguments work, we wouldn't have deductive arguments.
So the reason it necessarily follows is because, what I would say for myself is that that's just That's just what makes sense.
Exactly. And what makes sense is what we've made up.
But why are you saying we made it up?
Because you can't prove that principle.
That the conclusion necessarily follows?
Yeah, it makes sense. Okay, what if I said to you, there could be a demon that is playing with your mind, that it makes sense? That could be the case.
But that is like unlikely.
Based on what? Your limited experiences?
So you're saying conclusions necessarily follow because of rules we made up?
No. I'm not trying to explain why it necessarily follows. I'm trying to use that question to make you realize that there is a first principle in logical reasoning, or certain first principles we have to start with in order for logic to make sense. So for example, when I did my postgrad, I was doing logic. I found it so difficult because I wanted to know, well, why does this make sense? Because I was like, well, why have we made these rules up? And I could never get an answer because, the academic was telling me, these are just the rules. You just have to accept them. Once you learn to accept them, then you could do good logic. So what I did, I just had to trick my mind. And literally, it just made sense after. So look, given the fact that these are the rules, I'm adopting these rules of the game, and then this is how things are going to make sense in order for me to pass their exams. But the question does follow, well, why are these rules the rules? But in logical reasoning, we just have to make these rules up.
Okay, I might be getting ahead of myself because I read a little bit ahead, but I think when it comes to deductive reasoning, there's truths, right? Like you're basing your reason, it's not stuff you're just making up. They're not
No, because you could. It depends what you mean by truth. What do you mean by truth?
Okay, so what I mean is that you're not making stuff up. You're basing it on something outside of yourself.
Yes, which also has first principles. The first principle is that there are things outside of yourself. Do you see my point? And you can't even prove that there are things outside of yourself. By the way, I'm not saying that you have to now believe that everything's just in the brain and there's no real world. I'm not suggesting that. All I'm saying is that there are first principles in everything. Number one, we have to make logical rules up for things to make sense. Agreed. But we've made them up to a certain degree. Yes, are they coherent? Does it allow us to basically progress in the sphere of knowledge? Yes. But do we make the rules up? Indeed. Even ideas of truth, right? Some ideas of truth in the way that you just mentioned assumes that we have to have a real world. Well, that's something that we just have to assume in some context. Yeah? So, given the fact that everything has first principles, and this is why we need to be very, very careful, because when we read Islamic thought, and we read our traditional Aqidah books, we have to be very careful because sometimes the way they were written, they were like almost a reaction to existing philosophies of the time. But when you unravel and you study some of these books, you see that we even have assumptions ourselves too. Right? There's no such thing as a first principle or a metaphysically free sphere of knowledge. You have to start somewhere, right? And for me, I think one of the most powerful maybe assumptions or first principles about us, about Islam, is the concept of the Fitrah. Okay? Now, and I want to try and make you understand what I mean, why this is the first principle for us, and why this is a very key assumption for us in order for us to understand ourselves and reality.